Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zafar Sobhan from Dhaka, and Jon Danilowicz is joining us from Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. What time is it for you, Jon?
Great. Well, it's early morning, 7 a.m. So we got a good start, early start to the day.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great dedication. I don't know that I would be up for such a discussion that early in the morning. So much appreciated. I think this is the fifth episode of our Jay-Z show, and let's get right into it. I think the big story of the last few days has been the uprising in Nepal, which is at the time of recording has now come to some kind of a temporary conclusion. At least I think there's been a new head of government sworn in, the former Chief Justice. I think we've had parliamentarians. But why don't you share with us your thoughts on Nepal? What does it mean? Why did it happen? And what does it mean for the region in the future?
Sure. Well, I never served in Nepal. I had the opportunity to visit, and I followed events there from afar, not obviously as close as I followed events in Bangladesh. But there was a weird sense of deja vu as I was watching developments there. It reminded me very much of July 2024, when protests started and then built up. And there was a point at which I realized something was happening that I needed to pay attention to. Events in Nepal obviously moved much quicker than they did in Bangladesh. And fortunately, while the loss of life and the violence is obviously terrible, the scale of the violence was nothing like what was witnessed in Bangladesh. So one of the questions one has to ask themselves is whether there was a learning in Nepal from events in Bangladesh, whether the political leadership realized that the gig was up much earlier because they had seen how things had played out in Bangladesh. So the two countries are different. Obviously, the internal political dynamics in Nepal are very different than Bangladesh, but there were definitely some similarities, and I think these similarities will have implications in Bangladesh. The most obvious one is the fact that it was young people, again, the famous Gen Z, that was very much behind this. And the grievances, while different, had a certain similarity. Again, in Nepal, it was these Nepo babies. It was the lifestyles of the rich and infamous in Nepal, the scions of these political and economic elite families living lavish lifestyles amidst the grinding poverty that affects many people in Nepal. So the desire for something different was very much resonated. And I think the creativity of the young people, the way in which the young people came together and apparently on Discord had an election and decided who should be the interim leader. And then, events ensued. The Nepalese army played a role, as did the Bangladesh army in the end game and restoring some sense of stability and helping to bridge that gap. It looks like the initial plans from Nepal may be different, less ambitious in many ways than Bangladesh. But I
That could
think
be a learning as well.
Yeah, I think so, probably. And then the final thing I would say, which may bleed into later discussion, is the implications for Bangladesh, because this was happening around the same time as the Dhaka University Central Student Union elections were taking place. And there's been a lot of discussion about what those elections mean for the future of Bangladesh's politics. One big lesson for me from events in Nepal is that this Gen Z is not going to accept business as usual and the way that politics has been done. So I think that is a very salient point, which if I were a Bangladeshi politician, particularly from one of the more established parties, I would recognize that the tolerance, the patience of the people may not be what it had been in the past. How does it look from your side?
No, I mean, I think I would largely agree with that. When I look at what's happened in Nepal, it seems very clear that there was certainly inspiration of sorts taken from the events here in Bangladesh last year. And also, as you mentioned, learning. One of the things which is fundamentally different, and I think much to be grateful for, is that it did not take hundreds of people killed and thousands maimed before the government in Nepal decided that the jig was up. So I think that is, that's very useful. And I think that has implications and ramifications even beyond Nepal. Because, of course, when we turn back our view to Bangladesh, a lot of people are wondering with upcoming elections in the next 5 or 6 months, what's going to happen to the incoming government? Is it going to be business as usual? Are we just going to go back to exactly the way we were before, with perhaps the BNP in power rather than the Awami League in power? Has anything fundamentally changed? And I think the events of what's happened in Nepal over the last week have shown us that things have fundamentally changed. And I think that is a salutary reminder to the political class here in Bangladesh that, look, don't think what happened last year was a one-off. Something has fundamentally changed in the mindset of young people, and in fact all people, in this region. And what happened in Nepal, I think it's and I think it's useful because because of the events of the last year in Bangladesh, there was a thought that the steam had really run out of our Gen Z revolution, in that a lot of people were feeling fairly disillusioned and thinking that we would get business as usual after the upcoming election. And so I think that this has really given people food for thought. I think also the fact that the decision makers in Nepal have gone for a much less ambitious reform program. They've really just said that, look, we're going to have elections in March next year, and the remit of the interim government, such as it is essentially to hold things together and then hold the election and then get out, is, I think, also a function of what people have seen here in Bangladesh. They've seen just how difficult it is to bring about that thoroughgoing change in reform, which perhaps we'd all wanted to see once upon a time, but have found that after a year that it's one of those things which is really easier said than done. I think the other thing, the one last point actually I wanted to talk with you about on this before we move to matters domestic, and by domestic I mean Bangladesh, of course, is that once again you see people suggesting that there's the hidden hand of Uncle Sam behind this. And this is a narrative which I had to, and I wrote a piece, in fact, in Dhaka Tribune, did some good work. I was in Dhaka Tribune at the time, countering vis-a-vis Bangladesh. And of course, we have exactly the same conspiracy theorists saying exactly the same thing vis-a-vis Nepal, which I also feel, in the context of Nepal, is exactly the same as Bangladesh. I feel that, one, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened, but two, I feel it's a disrespect and a disservice to the people of these countries in their sense of agency. But I was wondering if that's something that caught your eye, whether you had anything to say about that.
No, absolutely. And again, the fact that these events are happening in two neighbors, again, in a broader South Asian region where I think the conventional wisdom has always been that either New Delhi is, pulling the strings, or that the United States, China, other great powers are meddling in internal affairs. This certainly shows that the agency of local people. Again, I don't follow Nepal that closely. I know that there's been a degree of political instability for some time, but nobody who I talk to who watches South Asia told me that, oh, Nepal is the next domino to fall, that, expecting that as summer moved into fall of 2025, there would be this dramatic change in Nepal. So I think you're right that events looked at on their own show that the people do have agency, that the idea that there's nothing that I can do as a Bangladeshi citizen or a Nepali citizen because somebody else is calling the shots is disproved by the facts on the ground. So again, I think this is something which is instructive. And I think if I were a regime otherwise in South Asia or elsewhere that was not responsive to the demands of the people, I would also be wondering what the implications were. And if I were a young person, and frankly, even in the United States, we've talked about before, where we're undergoing our own political challenges right now, I think young people have that now sense that they can have some agency and they can make a difference in their own countries.
No, what's fascinating is, of course, as I said, the conspiracy theorists also retrofit their theories to now bring in Sri Lanka and also Indonesia as well. And yes, there are similarities, but I think at the end of the day, what the real similarity is in terms of people's aspirations and people's democratic aspirations. And I think certainly these uprisings, these revolutions can take inspiration from one another, but the notion that they are, all part of some greater scheme or some greater stratagem is, I think, not only fanciful. I don't know. It betrays a certain, a certain lack of I think, understanding of actually just how arbitrary and capricious the world is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've always thought that for conspiracy theorists, what is partially what is motivating them is it's always nice if things have a simple explanation. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the alternative, that actually there is no simple explanation, that sometimes these things can happen for no good reason, or I mean for a good reason, but why doesn't they happen one after the other, is harder for people to deal with. But on that note, let's move to Bangladesh now. And before we end, I do think I would actually like to talk about America, because of course there's been a big incident just a few days ago with the assassination of not a political figure, but certainly a conservative voice who had a lot of sway. And I'm talking, of course, about the killing of Charlie Kirk on a university campus in Utah. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the university campuses in Bangladesh. What have you made of the recent elections at Dhaka University, Jawaharlal University, which gave the Jamaat-e-Islam's student wing, the Chhatra Shibir, sweeping victories in both bodies?
Sure. Well, one is the micro, looking at what's happening on the universities and looking at the elections themselves. And then the second is what are the implications more broadly for the political system in Bangladesh. And, I was thinking about this morning, and I think you can look at this in a simplistic way in terms of winners and losers. So the biggest winner, obviously, is Shabir, and by extension, the Jamaat Islami. And while I don't think in retrospect it was a surprise that you had the outcome that you had, but still many people were surprised, particularly those who weren't paying as close attention. And I think some people have drawn the wrong conclusions from that, which we can talk about. But as I was talking with friends about these developments, one of the comments which really has stuck with me was somebody saying that in some ways Jamaat is the biggest winner because now it's acceptable to be a supporter of Shabir or Jamaat. In some ways, the taboo has been broken. That in the past, people who might have been sympathetic towards Jamaat or Shabir had to hide this because of obviously the associations with 1971 and the charges that would ensue. But in the wake of 2024, in the wake of all of the developments, now people are coming forward and proudly proclaiming their ties to, again, whether it be Shabir or Jamaat, which potentially have implications going forward in the elections. And on a similar note, there had always been the knock on Jamaat or Shabir that they couldn't attract the support of women. The fact that just by nature of the numbers involved, a number of women must have voted, young women must have voted for the Shabir candidates for them to
No,
win.
it's not just a surmise, actually, because we can look at how the votes were broken down hostel by hostel, you see, because women, of course, live in separate hostels for men. So it's very clear that Shabir did very well among women.
Right. So that other, I think, conventional wisdom has been challenged. But then if you look at it in terms of losers, obviously, and we can talk about this, the BNP, I think, is a loser. Not just because the Chhatra Dal didn't have the support which the presumptive incoming government might expect. So, and the election results could be interpreted as a rejection of business as usual, and the fear that the Chhatra Dal is just another side of the coin for the Chhatra League. But I think in some ways the biggest losers in this have to be the NCP and the other elements of the students. Again, there's probably understandable explanations at the university level of why the students backed by the NCP or the left wing students didn't do as well. Although certainly there were candidates with a high profile. But I think in terms of the narrative of a student-led revolution, you would expect then that the beneficiaries of the student-led revolution would be those supporters of that grouping at the university level, and that certainly didn't turn out to be the case. So my guess is, or my hope would be, that the national parties are looking at the results of the student elections and thinking about how they're going to approach national elections. From the BNP side, certainly this need for change. And then, frankly, from the NCP, I would expect that there's some soul searching about whether or not actually to proceed on the electoral front by putting forward candidates if the prospects of winning aren't that high.
And that's an interesting point to conclude on, which I'll come to. I think I've been reading some pretty good analyses in various newspapers about these elections, talking to various people. And I think, again, there's, less to it than meets the eye. Most people say it's a fairly simple issue of the Jamaat, the Shibir, running a much better election than everyone else. They had candidates who were close to the ground. They reached out to people. They talked about the issues which people cared about. And this is in stark contrast to how Chhatradol comported itself. Most of the Chhatradol leaders were, the typical, quote unquote, student leaders from, years, if not decades ago, who didn't really have that kind of a relationship with the current students. They did not run a particularly good campaign. They didn't reach out. They were just not around. So for most people who were watching carefully, there was not at all any surprise that that Shibir did so well and BNP did so poorly. And in fact, this could also, one hopes, serve as a wake-up call for the BNP, because I think one of the things which we have seen over the last year is there has been a certain level of complacency which has entered into their public pronouncements, and in fact how they have negotiated with the NCP and the interim government on the issue of reforms and other such matters. It's almost as though they see themselves as a government in waiting, and therefore they feel that they don't really need to do much to earn people's votes. Just the mere fact that they're not the Awami League is going to be enough to sweep them back to power. So hopefully this election will serve as a wake-up call for the BNP, and they understand that, look, it's not going to be quite so simple. I think what I have yet to see, and I would like to see, is an analysis of why NCP did so poorly. And I think that's really a very interesting question. I'd be interested to hear what people have to say on that. I'd be interested to see about polling on that issue and on that question. One thing which is interesting is that, of course, for those of us who have been paying attention to opinion polls, which have been done by organizations such as Innovision, I think BIGD at BRAC University has also been doing some polling. This doesn't, again, come as too much of a shock. And one of the things which we had seen is that the big beneficiary of the youth vote, that is the 18 to 24 demographic, and had always been the Jamaat or the Jamaat/Shibir. And this had been apparent even in polling quite soon after last year's July uprising, which is quite an interesting phenomenon. Is one of the things we had noticed then is that Awami League still retained considerable support among Bangladeshi 60 and above, which I think also makes sense if you look at that demographic and what the Awami League, because of its role in 1971, would mean to them. Then every other demographic that favored the BNP, except for the 18 to 24 demographic, which surprisingly did not lean towards the Jamaat, but did not lean towards the NCP, but lean towards the Jamaat, which I think was a real surprise, and that we're really just seeing confirmation of this in the university elections, which we've seen. So I think that is fascinating. I think the other point I'd like to raise is that you have people like Shashi Tharoor writing in Indian newspapers, and of course there's this has led to a great deal of hand wringing, both on across the board and even inside the country, for those people who have serious concerns about the Jamaat and feel that this is this presages a massive lurch to the right, and this is in fact something to be deeply concerned about. It could be that it's none of those things, that it's really just a question of people responding to a political party who has been seen to be reaching out to their concerns, seems to be running candidates who have integrity and who are humble, and again and running on issues which matter to people. So it's not so much that the Bangladesh electorate or even the university electorate has moved to the right. It's so much as that the formula followed by the Jamaat or the Shibir to get this vote at the Daksu and Jahangarnagar University elections could easily be followed by other parties. So it's not that there's a sea change in Bangladeshi politics as much as one has feared. So I think that's it. But of course, one thing I would like to talk to you about, and you've talked about this in other forums, is that I think a lot of the concerns which more liberal Bangladeshis have vis-a-vis Jamaat and Shibir. You don't actually share those concerns. You think that they may be overblown. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and I think you're right. I mean, one issue is how this is perceived within the country, and as you note, there's been a fair amount of hand wringing. I think the chances, though, of an overreaction outside are much higher. And starting with India, there was a short clip that was circulating online, which you probably saw, of students, chanting hijab, hijab, hijab. Again, which was interpreted by many as, aha, see, here's the smoking gun that these students want all women to have to wear hijab. As I understand it, this was more of a way of congratulating a certain female candidate who had herself been ridiculed for wearing a hijab. She won overwhelmingly. So in some ways, this was mocking those who had criticized her, just as the chants of last July and August of Razaka were
Right.
used to mock Sheikh Hasina for her statements. Um, so I think any political party evolves over time. As I've said before, the Republican Party of today is not the Republican Party of 50 years ago, and you can say that for political parties around the world. I've had the opportunity to interact with a number of people in the Jamaat and the Shabir at all levels, and not just in recent times, but over my entire association with Bangladesh. And I think you're right. I don't share the concerns that many have. I have admittedly less skin in the game. I'm not a Bangladeshi. What happens in Bangladeshi politics doesn't affect me to the same extent. But I think my outside position gives me a sense of perspective that perhaps people, closer to the ground sometimes lack. From my interaction with individuals, whether it be within Jamaat, fellow travelers, sympathizers, members of the student wing, um, I see characteristics that go far beyond religion. That's not to say that there's not a religious or an ideological component. Every party has an ideology, although one can question in a Bangladeshi context what that ideology is. Again, not to beat up on the BNP, but I would struggle to say what is it the defining ideology of the BNP in 2025. One of the knocks on the NCP has been that beyond being the heroes of last July and August, they also haven't clearly articulated an ideology. The parties of the far left have the advantage of ideology, but don't have the advantage of any support. So with Jamaat, I think they do define themselves differently in terms of their view of religion than others on the political right. There are other religious-based political groups which are far more extreme in their views, in my experience. And I think one of the questions one should look at is where the Jamaat leadership, both the senior leadership of the party and the emerging leadership within the students, where do they look for inspiration? And they look for inspiration from a variety of countries, to include Turkey, to include Malaysia, to include other states with religious Islam, with Islamically inclined political parties that have attained power. They've learned lessons as well from other countries like Egypt, where there was a huge backlash after the Muslim Brotherhood came to power. So I think, for many in the West, they draw this kind of straight line between Pakistan and Bangladesh going back to 1971, and assume that what the goal is of the Jamaat in Bangladesh is to simply turn back the clock to 1971 or before, to reunite with Pakistan. This, in my experience, has certainly not been the case, even though
Sure.
many in Jamaat, like many others in the political spectrum, see the need for having some kind of relationship with Pakistan.
Yeah. I mean,
And
I've
even,
always
yeah,
found, yeah.
yeah. No, and I just
I've
say,
always
fine.
found the
Go ahead.
Pakistan thing. So finish up. Sorry, yeah, sorry.
No,
Please
no,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, I'm done. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I've always found the Pakistan thing really fanciful because, of course, one time there was a lot of, Pakistan influence here in Bangladesh, but I think this is ancient history now. No, you know, right now Bangladesh is a much bigger economy than Pakistan. In fact, on a per capita basis, is 33% bigger. I think Pakistan's ability to project power into Bangladesh is absolutely minimal. Again, once upon a time this was not the case, but certainly it is the case in 2025. But please, I did cut you off, so I'm
No,
sure.
no. The final point I would make is for people who watch Pakistan. While obviously Pakistan has had a problem with religious extremism or religious-based extremist groups, um, if you look at the Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, they've never been close to tasting political power, and certainly the power centers in Bangladesh and Pakistan have not been in either case, the Islamic political party. So there's definitely something changing, and in some ways, I think the political evolution in Bangladesh is much healthier than in Pakistan, where you have still the various political parties, the dynastic parties, Imran Khan's PTI, and the army, all at loggerheads and without some clear view of how to move forward. One silver lining of the Dhaka University elections was that despite the complaining, despite the excuses, at the end of the day, everyone has accepted the results. You've had even, I think, senior BNP leadership realize that claiming that the election was rigged was not a winning strategy. Particularly, again, if they look forward to a national election, which they hope to win, they don't want the losers to claim that the elections were rigged. So I think that was a positive development in terms of
Yeah.
how this might have some play going forward. And as you said, it also shows hopefully that candidates matter, running a good campaign matters, having issues that appeal to voters matter, and that nobody has a mantle that will just be handed to them.
Yeah, and I just wanted to bring you back to this conversation. Like I said, I mean, I think one way or the other, we will have to reckon with the Jamaat is going to be a more major factor in Bangladeshi politics. I think we agree that it's perhaps not quite as major as some people fear, but nevertheless, I think they've shown that they're certainly going to be a force to be reckoned with in the upcoming election in the years to come, in that they have a certain level of support among the Bangladeshi people. But getting back to the concerns which you feel perhaps, what should we be looking for in your estimate? What would the Jamaat or could the Jamaat do or say, which you are looking for as a sort of a benchmark, in that you say, okay, well, if this is a line that they cross, then I would have to rethink my analysis and think that there's something to be concerned about. Have you thought a little bit about what are the specific red lines you look for in your analysis that maybe we in Bangladesh would look for in terms of where we should also dig in terms of course, we want to invite everyone into the political process, but that cannot be at the expense of fundamental rights and freedoms for Bangladeshis. So where do you think a good place to draw those lines might be?
Sure. And I think, this goes back to me to kind of democracy 101, which is majority rule and minority rights.
Yeah,
That there may be an overwhelming majority of the Bangladeshi population that follows one religious set of beliefs, and that has implications beyond just religion in terms of public life. But there are also many Bangladeshis who don't subscribe to those religious beliefs, or while they themselves may be practicing Muslims, take a different view or interpretation of Islam. So I think, again, tolerance, acceptance of minority views. And in this regard, I give credit to the Shabir candidates who won the Dhaka University election and the signaling that they did immediately afterwards, including, some of the public, actions that they took in terms of visiting, the graveyard of the martyrs of 1971, in terms of paying homage to some of the founders of Dhaka University who had a very much a secular outlook. So I think this is one. You talked earlier about the tragic events in the United States with Charlie Kirk's assassination. And while I wouldn't compare the modern Republican Party to the Jamaat Islami, I think anyone who looks at American politics or looks at the United States has to realize that religion has been very central to our politics from the beginning. If you look over my shoulder, you'll see Louisa May Alcott's childhood home in Harvard, Massachusetts, the Fruitlands Farm and Museum, which was a utopian colony set up in the 1800s. Again, if you look to the U.S. founding, if you look at the 18th and 19th century, the political leaders of the United States very much came from a very strong religious background. And they, from the very beginning, were grappling to the extent to which religion should inform public life. These principles and these discussions continue to the current day. There's no denying that part of Charlie Kirk's appeal, even within the Republican Party or to young conservative voters, was very much a religious one, very much grounded in the Christian religion, in biblical pronouncements, including their implications on issues related to public life. So there's no way, in my view, to totally separate religion from politics. And beyond a politician's personal religious views, it's totally understandable that if I believe strongly in a certain religious viewpoint, and I think that this is the best way to live one's life, I might seek to see that reflected in public policy. But in the United States, there's a clear line of separation of church and state in the First Amendment of our Constitution. As Bangladesh struggles or looks at constitutional reforms, there's the issue of, what does secularism mean in 2025? What about Islam being the state religion? So again, I think any political party will have to struggle with this, and certainly, I think Jamaat, because of its background and because of its nature, I think it's important that it not only explain this, but when it appeals to voters, there's a certain understanding that the views of the voters need to be taken into account as the party proceeds, and as if Jamaat has a role, whether it be leading a government or more likely leading an opposition, they're going to have to pronounce on these and the other issues of the day.
No, that's very interesting because, of course, the conversation I've had, which mirrors what you just said, vis-a-vis the role of religion in public life, is not a conversation I've actually had with leaders or members of Jamaat-e-Islam, but interestingly with leaders and members of the NCP and other student leaders who were involved in the July uprising. The argument there being that, if you had mentioned, given some examples, if you look at the civil rights movement in the US, for instance, it was absolutely a religious movement. It was led by the Reverend Martin Luther King. It was led by black churches in the United States. The movement for the anti-slavery movement worldwide was again led by Christians, and it was grounded in Christian rhetoric, the idea being that slavery was an affront to God and Christianity, and it was on these grounds that these people who led the movement objected to it. Mahatma Gandhi's leading of the Indian independence movement was also grounded in religion, in religious iconography, in religious philosophy. Satyagraha is a religious term, and of course, and that had all kinds of impacts in terms of, that was one of the reasons I think Jinnah split with him and decided that he wanted to have a separate nation for the Muslims of the subcontinent. The point being, this is, and this has been a conversation I've had with many young Bangladeshis, this is considered perfectly acceptable in other contexts, but why is it that when Muslims try to organize politically, there seems to be some allergy against that? And it's a fair point. Interestingly enough, this is a conversation which has been brought into the public sphere much more eloquently by younger leaders and younger student leaders than the Jamaat themselves. I've not really heard them articulate this position with that much eloquence, but I think it does underpin everything we're seeing. I think these are conversations which are being had not just in Bangladesh but all over the world, and I think we can't wish them away. And as you say, I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to minority rights. We talk about secularism in the Bangladeshi constitution. There's been a huge discussion as to whether it should be dropped and replaced with pluralism, replaced with humanism. But of course, what strikes me is if you look at the Bangla version of the constitution, the word used there, because there's no actual one, well, I don't know if there is one, but the word used in the Bangladeshi constitution is dharma-nirapeksha, which means religious neutrality, which I think is a marvelous phrase. And it doesn't come freighted with perhaps some of the baggage the word secularism comes with in certain circles. And I think that is something which must remain at the heart of Bangladesh as a nation, is that, whether we are a Muslim majority nation, whether we want to see a greater role of religion in public life, as some people do. At the end of the day, however you wish to that manifests itself, as long as minority rights are respected and minorities are able to live as full and equal citizens of Bangladesh, that has to be an area, that has to be where we draw the line in terms of dealing with all these political parties. On that note, I think we're out of time. This is always, as always, has been a really thought-provoking discussion. As always, I wish we had more time, but I will catch you again 2 weeks from today, and we can pick up. I'm sure there'll be plenty of new things for us to discuss then. Thank you so much, Jon.
Great. Thanks, Zafar.
And thank you for tuning in. Catch us again 2 weeks from today. Bye-bye.